the thing that I have come to see, a way of expressing it, is that it's hard to imagine the silence that was around us. We were invisible and silent and silenced. So when we started speaking up, and that was the whole essence of gay liberation, was the coming out strategy.
Right.
Rather than trying to negotiate favors like the homophile movement had done in the 50s and 60s, getting respectability from psychologists and clergymen and so on, we were just going to say, look, here we are. Mm-hmm. Get used to it.
It has been 50 years now since the 1976 Montreal Summer Olympics, and the city is celebrating it. It seems there's plenty of festivities happening around the Olympic Park. There's an exhibit happening at the McCord Museum around it. There seems to be a strangely jovial attitude towards it. And there's some memorial pieces that have come out. There's a great one in Maisonneuve magazine by Taylor C. Noakes that I find does a good job of remembering those Olympics. I wanted to set some space aside on Local 514 to look back at the Olympics and not really cover the stuff that's been covered, you know. I think the financial burden of the Olympics is something that has been well documented. The sort of arrogance of Jean Drapeau and the other Olympic commissioners around the project, I think, is very clear. It's been 50 years after all. But I wanted to set some time aside to talk about things that are important to Local 514, and that's organizing, leveraging for power, direct action, mobilizing. For this two-part series on the Montreal Olympics, I speak to activists, athletes, historians who were there at the time, who can shed light on maybe the less remembered aspects of it. This first interview is with Ross Higgins, a gay historian, former educator, former professor here at Concordia, also used to be a professor at UQAM, and the co-founder of the Archives Gays du Québec. Ross comes on to talk about the police raids that were happening in and around Montreal, around Canada even, leading up to the Olympics, in an effort to clean up the country, the city, to make it presentable to a Olympic audience, to the tourists. Ross has some really affecting testimony to witnessing those raids, to seeing friends being swept up by these different police raids on bars, on bathhouses. And importantly, Ross comes on to share what it is that the community did in wake of those. Here's the interview. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Local 514. Today, we continue our coverage of the 50th anniversary of the Montreal Olympics, the Montreal 1976 Olympics. Of course, the actual Olympics we care less about. What is of interest to us and our program is obviously the activism and organizing around these Olympics. One of the interviews I did was with Bruce Kidd, who spoke about the anti-apartheid organizing that happened around the 1976 Olympics. Today, I'm speaking with guest Ross Higgins about the sort of social cleanup, the social urban cleanup that Jean Drapeau was undertaking in the lead up to the 1976 Olympics, which included the mass arrests at various Montreal gay bars and bathhouses. Ross Higgins is the co-founder of the Archives Gays du Québec, as well as a retired professor. You taught many courses at Concordia, UQAM, around queer communities here in Montreal, sexuality, and I'm sure that, that's only the tip of the iceberg, I guess, for what you've covered. But thank you for making time and coming on to our show today.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah. On this hot August day. Let's get right into it. So I did a little bit of research on this, and I think I think this kind of urban cleanup seems to have sort of it extends beyond just the Olympics. But if you could talk a bit about what you saw at the time, since you arrived in Montreal in 1975, just the year right before the Olympics, what was the prevailing attitudes? What was the sort of sentiment in the air?
Well, it was quite a different scene than the one I had left in Toronto. I would say when I came from Toronto, where I had already been a little bit involved in the movement, there were maybe 8 gay bars, like places where you could actually meet people without... and in Montreal, there were 40. Oh, wow. And in Toronto, when you were on Yonge Street, where most of the gay places were in those days, you often had gangs of kids going by in cars yelling, "Hey, faggot," that kind of thing. That didn't happen here very much. I mean, there was violence against us, but it was not nearly as flagrant. And I was very impressed early on. I joined the collective that was running the androgyny bookstore, which later became La Librairie L'Androgyne. And one of the guys was going out with a francophone and was invited to the family for Christmas, which in Ontario, I'd never heard of anybody being invited to their lover's family for Christmas. So it was a very, much more tolerant place in many ways. But there was always in the background, in the gay bars and other spaces, a kind of campaign of homophobic violence and arrests and all kinds of things that had been going on for decades. Mm-hmm. And it was nothing new in the 70s. One thing that was interesting about the 70s is someone told me that I interviewed a man that I had met in the Association pour les droits des gays du Québec that was founded at the end of all the series of events we're going to be talking about. He told me that he had been around for a long time. In the past, when there was a raid, the police would come into some place and just arrest the number of people that was in their quota. Wow. They had the morality squad had a quota of the number of people. And he had been in a raid where he didn't get arrested in a bar that was over just behind where the McCord Museum was, that McCord took over the space now. But a couple was there. One of them was being arrested by the police, and the other man begged the police to arrest him, but they said, no, we've got enough. Wow. So it was a very different world. Another man was arrested at the Colonial Baths in 1962, and he was there with a friend of his, and they were accused of having committed gross indecency together, and the friend was the last person in the place that he was going to have sex with. But the friend was also the son of a judge. So his name disappeared from the list of accused, and somebody else was matched up with him as being co-accused of gross indecency. Mm-hmm. So there was a very sort of cynical, quota-based, we've got to get so many arrests this year, and that was it. But after 1975, particularly with the raid on the Aquarius sauna in February of 1975, there was a different attitude, and they arrested everybody. In those places. And they used for the first time the law on the common body house, which to us was like a heterosexual brothel. Mm-hmm. It had never occurred to us that anything like that could be brought against a gay place, but it was. And it was all, the newspapers, which were quite ignorant in those days, talked about it as when the raid happened on the Neptune sauna in the spring of 1976, that it was a homosexual network that had been broken up with, the arrest of 70 men. And it was complete fantasy.
Oh, so when they say network, are they imagining like some kind of like criminal gang of sorts, I guess?
Well, no, they were just throwing words around to create a negative effect. Right. Basically, which was what they did in all the coverage. If you look at the news coverage in the 70s, even the 80s, it's extremely negative. Mm-hmm.
So I'm kind of curious. So then when we're looking at these raids that started happening in the 70s, like the one on Neptune and Aquarius, mm-hmm. Is it those you think are sort of part and parcel of this history of raids, but what changed then prior to the Olympics then was the sort of like, they're not just going for a quota, they're just arresting everyone there then.
Yes, and it was part of a new campaign orchestrated, as we found out from the work of Gary Kinsman and Patrizia Gentile, and Canada's War on Queers is the main text about this, that it was part of a coordinated attempt by the RCMP to control the possibilities of violence around the Olympics in 76, because the context is that in 1972 at the Munich Olympics, a whole bunch of Israeli athletes were massacred. So Canada did not want to have anything like that happen during the games here. So it was this context. But the idea that, homosexual activists were going to do something on that of that type, it was complete fantasy. I mean, but it was part and parcel of the whole, the idea going back to the fruit machine, getting people out of the civil service and the armed forces in the late 50s and 60s that, they just ran with all these absurd, very, very conservative ideas about what homosexuality is. And
I'm a little confused. What could you reference something called the fruit machine?
Oh, yes. Well, that was one of the things that Gary and Patricia talked about. There was, and it's well discussed in this recent book by Jean-Charles Panton on the history of LGBTQ plus in Quebec and Canada. They had a sort of charlatan psychologist who invented an actual machine, but was basically showing people pictures of different things and having electrodes attached to them and finding out whether their pupils dilated or whatever kind of thing when they saw a pornographic image or something. So it was not much of a machine.
Pseudoscience. Sort of, right, yeah.
But it also happened to coincide because the word fruit was used in English, to mean tapette or homosexual.
Sure. Right, of course. So I guess let's go back there then. And so it's 1975. You've just got here the year before the Olympics, and these raids start. And I guess now what you're pointing out is that these raids are now just arresting anybody and everybody there, right? I'm kind of curious how the community at the time kind of reacted to those raids.
Well, it mobilized the community, especially when 70 people were arrested all at once. But that was just part of a whole series. I mean, I have the list here on one of my pages, if I can read it. There was the raid on the Aquarius in February of 1975, and then in Ottawa there was a vice ring that was broken, according to what they said, in March of 75. And there were constant, visits of the police to the gay bars downtown, especially the places like the Rock and Bull that was on Stanley and Bud's, Babyface. So both men's and women's bars. The Toro d'Or was on Drummond Street. Chez Fernand was a kind of marginal place down on Dorchester. And then in 1976, there's a raid in January on the Club Sauna, one in February on the Crystal Sauna. The Neptune Sauna was the 14th of May, and that led to the creation of the Comité Homosexuel Anti-Répression, the gay committee against repression. We organized, I was part of that movement, we organized the first independent gay demonstration. There had already been gay contingents in a couple of earlier demonstrations, but that was the first time that we were on our own in the streets in a very official, with a permit demonstration.
Contingents part of other protests about other topics? Or
Had been, yes, in the May Day March.
Oh, of course, right.
In the year before I came here, in 75, there had been the first gay contingent there, but even in 1971, there was the first real appearance of gay militants in a public forum at an anti-confederation demonstration that was organized July 2nd of that year, I believe, and one of the people actually was invited to speak to the crowd, and I think it was in Parc La Fontaine. So that was the beginning of a real open gay movement. There had been a previous attempt at a homophile group in the late 60s, but that no one seemed to have any memory of that.
So I'm kind of curious, as this protest is sort of being organized, I'm wondering what the mood was like in the room. What were people saying? What were people thinking of these raids that were going on?
Well, we called, there was a kind of a group of people, not just from the group I was in, GAP, but various other people, the Androgyny Bookstore people, and some groups from women's groups came as well to a preliminary meeting. We decided that we would hold a public meeting at McGill in the Student Center. We arranged to have a room there, and it attracted 120 people or something, including the owners of the Neptune, who came, and there was a discussion in the organizing group, and we were basically kind of left-wing people, that about whether or not it was a good idea to try and have a demonstration. And we were kind of nervous about it in the pre-Olympic context. But when we had the second biggest meeting, the crowd insisted we had to demonstrate. So that was like interesting. Because there were all kinds of people from different backgrounds there. But, people were fed up by this time. There had been a building awareness of changes necessary in gay life, since the early 60s. It's even the publication of the Kinsey report revealed that there were so many of us, and so on. But by the 70s, people were really, really ready for a change and ready to do anything. It was kind of the period where we said to ourselves, well, the only way they can stop us is to kill us. So, and we were, a privileged group in many ways, because a lot of us came from middle-class backgrounds. We had connections and resources that other minorities didn't really have. So it was a time when there was a huge change, and it happened relatively recently, but also quickly in those few years, in the middle of the 70s. There was a rapid shift in public opinion as we began to express our point of view. Why don't we have the right to live?
I'm curious what at the time Char or GKAR kind of imagined as the main antagonists of this kind of like repression faced by the police. Did they imagine it coming from the RCMP, the federal body, or from Jean Drapeau himself?
Well, it was hard to say, but we associated it with the municipal association, the municipal administration at the time, and we didn't know about the whole nationwide campaign until much later.
Right.
And Gary and Patricia did a lot of access to information requests, and provided me. Gary gave me some transcripts of a meeting at Sir George Williams, possibly right close to where we're sitting, in 1972, where a spy was present and presented, page after page of notes of what was said in this early gay liberation meeting. It's quite fascinating. One wishes that one knew the names. The names are all blacked out now.
Well,
but some of them are people that that resurface later.
And the people, the names are people who was at these meetings, or I don't understand. Yes. Gotcha. Yeah.
Because this has never been seen before. I mean, it's hard to imagine now, because people take all sorts of things for granted. Somebody wanted to do research at the archives and wanted to start by going through the gay periodicals of the 1960s, and I said, "Well, you're done."
Well,
it was. The thing that I have come to see, a way of expressing it, is that it's hard to imagine the silence that was around us. We were invisible and silent, and silenced. So when we started speaking up, and that was the whole essence of gay liberation, was the coming out strategy.
Right.
Rather than trying to negotiate favors like the homophile movement had done in the 50s and 60s, getting respectability from psychologists and clergymen and so on, we were just going to say, look, here we are. Get used to it.
That's interesting. It's an interesting distinction of, I guess, tactics, right, from this prior movement of trying to, in the most polite way, just get a little more space compared to maybe this moment, which is like really just taking up that space, right?
I wish I knew more about Paul Bédard and the International Sex Equality Anonymous, which was the name of his group, which was affiliated with the big conferences of homophile organizations in the States. But when I say big, the total number of people involved in the homophile associations could not have been more than 5,000 all over the continent. And what happened in the mid-'70s, and here especially, and we haven't come to the next stage of the trucks raid in 77, but after that, people poured into the gay organizations, just as they had in New York after the Stonewall riots in 1969. Suddenly, from a very small group of people, considering the size of New York and all of that, there were, thousands of people who were willing to put their necks on the line.
No, yeah. I mean, let's get right into that, right? So, I mean, so far we've been talking mostly about the kind of context of this urban cleanup led by the municipality, aided by these federal bodies like the RCMP, which involved, like you've named, raids on bars, on bathhouses. But and there was this protest that happened right before the Olympics. But I'm kind of curious what was. Like, the Olympics happened, and then afterwards, these raids continued, right? You're talking about trucks now.
Yes. I mean, it took a long time for the change that was going on to actually sink in with the police. In fact, it took decades, and it didn't really come until the middle of the 90s when you could see a visible shift in the official attitudes, because there was the trucks raid in 1977. There were a couple of major sauna raids in 1980. And then there was the Buds raid in 1984. And finally, there was the Cox raid, the KOX raid in 1984 was the Buds raid, 1994 was the Cox, and that was the last really big one. I mean, there was another raid on the stock bar, not the stock bar, but the Taboo bar around 2000, I think. But it was much less extensive, It was, and involved accusations of involving minors, but that was never proven, I think.
Were the reasons for these raids by the SPVM or the RCMP always sort of shifting, or was it always the same reason, like body houses?
Yeah. I mean, it was always, you talk about an urban cleanup, but it was really a moral cleanup, and that was the way it was framed by the municipality and by the police. We've broken a ring of prostitution kind of thing.
Sure.
I mean, there was an attack even in the 60s on Paul Bédard. He was accused of, offering a connection service to underage kids, which he was later acquitted of, but it kind of didn't help the beginnings of any kind of organizing in Montreal at that time.
Oh, I'm kind of curious about the organizing by GCAR and after the Olympics. What was the main kind of like goals of the organization after the Olympics?
Well, after the Olympics in the fall of '76, GCAR became the Association pour les droits des gays du Québec, which was set up like in a parallel with other kinds of gay liberation organizations, which by that time had lost a bit of the sort of hippie flavor of the early days and were far more concentrated on obtaining legal changes like protection in the Human Rights Code.
Which came a year after.
But as a result of more police action.
Right.
So that was... the setting up of, what we call the ADGQ became an umbrella group that offered, a space where people could drop in on St. Catherine East. Ironically, it later became a gay dancer bar, or a heterosexual dancer bar, I should say, rather, but a male dancer bar. Anyway, now disappeared, part of UQAM. And... the organization then, proceeded to encourage all kinds of initiatives. And at the same time, in this period, people were setting up different kinds of groups, of different interest groups. And eventually there were cooking groups and bowling clubs and volleyball teams and all that kind of thing. So it was a period that, this process was already going on because the movement was growing slowly, but the police actions really helped to make people aware of it, and brought out many more people than had been previously involved.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious what your what was the prevailing opinion of the police? Like when you see police, was there any kind of cross solidarity against the police with other kind of communities? I'm kind of curious.
Well, we had been working on trying to develop solidarity with unions, for example, and sometimes professional groups. When the spring of 1976 arrests took place, and I think it was at the second of the public meetings that we held, I ended up being the secretary of a group that was like a committee was set up in the meeting to talk about getting support from unions and the bar association and things like that. And that was the first time I ever had to speak French in a public context because nobody else in the little group I was in was willing to, and I was actually part of the organizing committee. So it made sense. And then we proceeded to write letters to these groups, and they all said, "Oh, yes, 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 we support you."
It was successful then.
It was successful, but it was a hollow success.
Oh, sure.
Especially, the big labor central groups, the CSN and so on, did support us, but that didn't mean that their membership supported us.
Of course.
So it was an easy thing for the top people to do, but it took a lot longer for attitudes to change.
What do you contribute to attitudes changing then over the span of decades that
Well,
followed?
we started talking and being out there, and there was, by the end of the 70s, there were gay radio shows and TV shows on cable TV and newspapers and so on. So we had a voice, which we had not had previously. I mean, there were halting efforts to set things up, even going back to the very early 70s, around the time of the setting up of the Front de Libération Homosexuelle in 71. And a whole wave of tabloids were published, including Omnibus, that was named for the bill in the federal parliament that had decriminalized homosexuality. But it took a long time for this kind of changed discourse to seep out into the wider medium. But it really came, I thought, after the trucks raid, when all of the papers condemned the police, just as this is a waste of money, why are we going after these people?
Right, yeah.
Kind of thing.
Did you feel that the sort of like public outcry for that police, those police raids, do you think that was stronger in Quebec specifically than it was in places like Ontario? Because before you mentioned about like a sort of a bit of a difference of social acceptability from your time in Toronto versus in Montreal. Would you say that continued on in the decade after?
Yeah, you'd have to look up the public opinion surveys of the time. I don't really know. But definitely I experienced it as a much more open kind of society here, at least in Montreal. And, as some people said, we once had a benefit screening for the Gay Archives with Pierre Valliere. And he said, yeah, it's very tolerant in the plateau and, the central area of Quebec City where all the cool people live. But go out to the suburbs or go up to the rural areas. And this was, in the 90s. So it was, but, things have changed, I think, everywhere. I'm
kind of curious about the wider work of archives and like kind of going through memory of it, the memory of queer memory in Quebec. I'm kind of curious, what are some things about trying to create that kind of archive that you've ran into that people might not expect or know about?
Well, I'm not quite sure what what to say about that. I got into the idea of setting up the archives when I worked at Androgyny, and I had met Jacques Prince, who was the co-founder of the archives, in a bar, and then recruited him to Androgyny, which by that time had become l'Androgyne. At the end of the 70s. And someone had suggested, there was already the Canadian Gay Archives, as it was initially called, the Archive today, in Toronto. And I knew the people because I came from Toronto, and they were very helpful in the early stages of setting up our archive, but it was probably their inspiration that really gave me the idea. But somebody in the bookstore had suggested that we should send all of our stuff to them. And Jacques and I didn't think that people from here would go and do research in Toronto. So we thought we would just try and start our own project. It was a completely insane idea if you look back. But, now the archives is this huge thing where you can hardly find a seat in the research room because there's so many people going through all kinds of stuff and all kinds of shows going on and films being made and so on. So
Incredible.
It's quite a trajectory. The archives was in my apartment for the first 10 years, and I had to have, visitors who wanted to do research come, and they always wanted to come at 9 a.m, which was not my time. So, and it got really tiresome after a while. By the end of the 80s, we had already obtained our corporate status, and then we got, with some help from various other community groups, charitable status. So we were able to go out there and raise money from the community that allowed us to rent our first office. Thankfully, I got them out of my house. But it was a long process, and took a long time to get established. Even with that, and there were months when we had to dip into our own pockets to pay the rent and things like that. But it has turned into this immense operation now. So, we haven't talked a lot about trucks in this whole conversation, but it was really the turning point. People talk a lot about Sex Garage, but I think trucks was a much more impactful event. Sex Garage was very important and certainly affected members of that generation. But looking back, and there's been a lot of historical interest. Last winter there was the play Les Corps Fantômes at Place des Arts, and they dramatized the 80s quite well and the impact of AIDS, which is the background also to the formation of the archives. Since the time when we started it, we didn't know what was going to happen to us or anything that we had been working on for all those years, so we wanted to make sure that there was some memory preserved. But the way the present generation looks back at those days is somewhat surprising to me now.
In what way?
Well, it seems so distant to people now. And as I was saying, people just cannot hear the silence that I heard as a 15-year-old.
No, of course, yeah. We're running towards the end of our time here. I'm thankful for for coming onto the show and sharing with us these experiences you've kind of been through, and this, of course, this body of research that you've put together of these raids and speaking on them. I'm kind of curious, is there anything that, any exhibitions going on or campaigns that you want to share with the audience?
Well, one of the people who was really instrumental in my work was John Banks, who I met almost immediately when I came here in 1975. He had one of the early vegetarian restaurants that was on Duluth Street. Before there were restaurants on Duluth Street. After that, John set the trend, and Duluth became, a place to go for eating. And he ended up being the organizer of the first Gay Pride in 1979. And he was very instrumental in my work on the bar history, which was a background for understanding of the community before 1970. And he introduced me to Armand Monroe, who was the MC at PJ's, which was a drag club on Peel Street. And eventually in the 80s, PJ's became a major rallying center for trans people who were just in the process of community formation at that time, I would say. So Armand died at the end of 1973, and John died in June of 2024, not 1973. I'm afraid I'm getting tired. Armand died in 2023 at the end, and John died in 2024 in June. So we wanted to do a show to celebrate their lives. And both of them were very involved. It's a kind of difficult question around, because the emergence of the trans community has changed things from the relationships that existed, which were not necessarily particularly good, but trans people and gay people were in the same basket as far as the society was concerned. Homosexuals were men who dressed in women's clothing as far as the tabloid newspapers presented it. So we've tried to put some of the drag parties and some of the very nasty tabloid coverage from the 60s and earlier and on the walls, and also lots of pictures of their friends. They ended up, John and Armand put on a production of Rocky Horror Show in 1978 or so, and then, the next year they organized the Gay Pride. Armand was the host of the Gay Pride that the ADGQ hosted in 1980. From that, it moved from Duluth Street down to Dominion Square, which was a much more official kind of visible place, and kept up, with public visibility for years. And they were less involved in the organizing against AIDS, but that whole period was one that really galvanized us as well. So I've had a very interesting life.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for coming on and sharing a bit about it. Where is this exhibition exactly?
It's at the Archives Gay du Québec, which is at 1000 Adadécan. office number 201A. There's a poster on the door of 1000 Onondaga, which was just at the corner of La Gauchetière, just down a little bit from the village.
Perfect, perfect. And how long is this exhibition running?
It's going to be on until Labor Day, the 7th of September.
All right, wonderful. Well, folks, you know where to catch this exhibition. Thank you so much, Ross, for joining us and sharing a bit about this history.
Thanks for having me.
Take care, everyone.